If you have your Bible, you can turn to Genesis 21 this morning. We'll be reading there in just a moment. You can follow along as we do Genesis 21, the second half of that chapter, starting in verse 22. I was thinking this week about a sermon I heard at a youth camp a long time ago. I think I was probably 14 years old. And the closing challenge that pastor gave was, if Jesus hasn't changed you, then he hasn't saved you. Now, for a 14-year-old coming from a Christian home, that was a good challenge. I was having to consider what does it mean to really be saved? What does it mean for Jesus to change you? And I won't give you the whole sermon, but he wasn't making a works appeal there. He was just describing how entering into a relationship with Jesus makes a difference in our life. It may be a small one at first, it may be a great one at first, we don't know. I'm not saying it has to be this way, but he was making it clear that accepting Jesus changes the way that you live. It changes the way you think, it changes the way you behave, it changes the way you react. So as we continue our study of the life of Abraham today, I want to notice specifically how Abraham was changed and talk a little bit about why. Last week we covered what I called the most important event in redemption history for over 1,000 years at the time, and I can defend that. I'm making that as my statement, but we described the birth of Isaac for Abraham. Remember the story here that we're talking about? Abraham and Sarah had left their homeland in Ur in faith of the promise of God, and for 25 years they had been waiting for God to fulfill his promise to give them a son. And when that promised son was finally born, Abraham was 100 years old, and the Bible says that Sarah was 90. They waited 25 years, and they waited clearly beyond the time that anyone would expect for them to still have a child. In fact, in the New Testament, in both Romans and Hebrews, it makes it clear that they were clearly beyond the time. It says that they were as good as dead. In other words, it says that this was a miracle child. God kept his word, and Isaac became the incarnation of the promise of God. We talked last week a little bit about this type or this picture of Jesus, that Isaac is the promised son, and in patience, Abraham and Sarah waited for him, and when he came, he brought new life to those who were, as the Bible says, as good as dead. So we're seeing already the symbolism and the meaning of the birth of Isaac for Abraham and Sarah and for us as well. Now, the next account in the book of Genesis seems pretty insignificant. And when we read it this morning, as I did earlier this month and then earlier this week, you may say, well, this seems like a real kind of decline or let down after the birth of Isaac, the very next story being something that's so mundane. But I do think it shows a great deal about how the birth of Isaac changed the way Abraham and Sarah thought and behaved. So it's not that long this week. Look with me at Genesis 21, starting in verse 22. We'll just read to the end of the chapter. It says, "At that time Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, 'God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned.' And Abraham said, 'I will swear.' When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, 'I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today.' So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, 'What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart?' He said, 'These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well.' Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines." Now again, it does seem like a letdown to go from the momentous occasion of Isaac's birth, especially if as I say, if that's the most important event in redemption history for 1,000 years, to go from that story to this little account about Abraham dealing and making a treaty with one of his neighbors. But there's more to the story than you may realize at first. This is the first major event to show you how things are different now that Isaac is born. So before, Abraham and Sarah were growing weary in their waiting. They were beginning to live like everything was over for them. But now, the appearance of the promised son has given Abraham an eternal hope. So at the end of this account, there is mention that Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. If you have the King James Version, some of the older versions say he planted a grove. Most of the newer translations are saying it was a specific tree, a tamarisk tree, not a tree that's familiar to us here, but it's well known in that area. In either case, it's very clear that he planted either a tree or trees there. And the question is, why did Abraham plant a tree? This is somewhat unique. I mean, it's not the only place, but it's pretty close to the only place where we have something like this in the Old Testament. And some people have suggested that this would have become a place of worship for Abraham, and that he was basically, in fact, one of the old commentators said it was like his outdoor cathedral, that he was planting the trees so that he would have this rooftop, in a sense, overhead for him to go and worship under. We know that he dwelt near the oaks of Mamre in the middle of the Promised Land. That's one of the places where he went when he first came to the land of Canaan. So he was attracted to a place, probably had good watering there for his flocks. It had some shelter there with the trees. Now he's planting the same thing here in the southern part of the Promised Land. We also know that many cultures have worshipped under trees. It's something we find throughout ancient history, way up until almost the modern times, that many different religions would have their place of worship under a tree. But that's why it's kind of interesting to me. That is not typical in the Old Testament, right? That is not something the people of Israel or the people who were followers of the one true God were commanded to do. They were building altars. We see Abraham doing that. We see the people of Israel later doing that. But in fact, they were specifically discouraged, later at least, from worshiping under the trees, at least like the people of the Promised Land do later. So there's kind of a puzzle to figure out, what does this mean? And I have to say that this is something that, to me, became clear because of a story. So let me tell you a little personal story. None of you ever met Sarah's grandfather on her dad's side. His name was H.C. He was a great man. He lived to be 82 years old. He died in 2012, so he's been gone for quite a few years now. Served in the Air Force during World War II, worked many years as an electrician, raised 3 sons. He was a great person. He was also a native Floridian. So if you've ever been to South Florida, there's not many native Floridians. Most everybody has come from somewhere else. That's where people move to. But he was from that area. He grew up there his whole life, so he had been there a long time. And that means he knew a lot about the area. He knew about what kind of plants grew there. He knew about what kind of trees grew there, specifically citrus trees. That's a great place to grow citrus. South Florida is famous for that. And he had grown during his lifetime. By the time I knew him well, he'd grown quite a few successful citrus trees: grapefruit, orange, tangerine, and just like growing fruit trees anywhere, you need to know what you're doing. You need to know how to fertilize. You need to know what plants grow best where. And so he knew a lot of that through many years. Knew lots of different varieties. But the story I remember, it was probably only a couple of years before he died. We were walking around his house. We were talking about some of the things that he had planted there, or things that would be good to plant. He had an eye for that and was thinking about what kind of fruit trees would be good. But then he said something kind of offhand to me. He said, but I don't plant young trees anymore. Now, and he wasn't depressed about this. He said it with kind of a twinkle in his eye, and he had a good laugh. He said it with a little bit of a chuckle, like, you know what I mean by that. And I had never thought about that. If you've ever planted a fruit tree here, and the same is true for citrus, you don't get immediate results from that. So if you plant a small orange tree now, you won't be getting any fruit from it for 5 years, right? If you plant a small one, if you plant a sapling, you won't be getting any fruit for 5 years. You won't be getting good fruit for more like 7 years. And HC was 80 years old, and he was recognizing, hey, I love to plant trees. I know all about this, but I'm in all likelihood not going to be around to be reaping the benefits of these little trees that I plant. I thought that was interesting. I thought it was wise. It was showing how he was in tune with the arc of his life. He wasn't depressed about it. He just knew that was true for him. I thought about that when I was reading this passage, and for the first time I realized why it is significant that Abraham plants a tree. How old is Abraham at this time? He was 100 when Isaac was born. Isaac's already been weaned. 101, 102, he's 103, he's 100 plus years old, and the Bible tells us that he was interested in planting a tree that it would take him years to enjoy. So let's say that the old commentators are right and Abraham was looking forward to the day when he worshiped his God under the canopy of the trees that he planted in Beersheba. How many years would that be from now? 10 years, 12 years, 15 years? Abraham is 100 years old, and suddenly his view has changed, and he's looking much farther into the future. That's why at this time he calls on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, right? In every passage we've been looking at here in the book of Genesis this time, we've been looking for the name of the Lord, right? That name Yahweh, the great name of God in the Old Testament. This is where it is at in this passage. But it also comes with one of the other names of God, a descriptive name, and Abraham calls him El Olam, the God of enduring time. Right before Isaac is born, Abraham and Sarah have reached the point. They're weary in waiting, and they're living like time is running out for them. Now he's thinking about the fact that time never runs out for God. His whole mindset has shifted from this is the end for me, things are wrapping up, things are winding down for me, to now he's saying, there is an everlasting God who controls all time. He's in charge of all things. It's hopeful thinking. This mindset of eternity all of a sudden came to Abraham because he had now received the promised son. For him to see that the very real Isaac, he now has this son, maybe 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. He can hold him in his arms. He's a symbolic representation that even though he was as good as dead, God has now made him the father of nations, like he promised, that God was fulfilling his promises to him. And it gave him confidence in the everlasting God. It gave him this kind of eternal hope. Hopefully you know where I'm going with this, but shouldn't that be the same difference that receiving Jesus makes in our lives today? Do you see what the Bible is describing here? That Abraham had before this reached a point where things were drawing to an end for him, and then comes the promised son, and suddenly his focus is not on himself, but it is on the everlasting God, that there is an eternal God who will keep his promises for me. In that sense, that Isaac is, like we said last week, a type of Jesus, whom God would send, that God would send his promised son. And to receive the promised son is to get this eternal hope. It's to get this everlasting mindset that we're thinking about the God who holds all time in his hands. It's interesting what Paul writes to the Galatians. I want you to look at this passage and follow it. It's a little more complicated, this, if you want to get it in its context in Galatians. But look what it's saying in reference to Abraham. Now it says, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. And Paul goes into some detail here. He said it does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. It's Paul himself in the New Testament that interprets for us the birth of Isaac to Abraham with the coming of Jesus for us. He says, look, the ultimate fulfillment of the promises to Abraham came through Isaac and is now realized in Jesus. And that's why he says, now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. And then he says, if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So I'm not making this up. This is exactly what Paul says. Paul is saying that just as Abraham received the promised son, and then with that incarnate, with that very real promised son, his mind is no longer focused on the temporary parts of this world, on waiting for God's promise, but instead his mind is lifted up and he thinks about the everlasting God, this eternal hope that we have. It is worthwhile for us just to stop and think for a minute. Are you an heir of the eternal hope that Abraham had because you've received Jesus, God's promised son? I mean, that is the critical question. Have you reached the point in your life where you're saying, whether you're old or young, I don't really see any future for me. I mean, I might concede that there's some time or years to come, but I don't see what that matters for me. Or have you received Jesus? And you say, well, look, the future for me is an everlasting future. I worship an eternal God. See, if we think about it in this light, the rest of this count is a demonstration now of how things are different with Abraham now that he has the promised son. If you have your Bible open still, look back just one chapter. So back in Genesis chapter 20, we're introduced to this relationship with Abraham and Abimelech. Abimelech is king of the Philistine city of Gerar, and we have this interaction. It's a shameful interaction for Abraham, right? Abraham allows his wife to be taken into Abimelech's household, and God has to appear to Abimelech in a dream so that he will give Sarah back to Abraham. This is right before the birth of Isaac. In fact, we don't know if Sarah's pregnant yet with Isaac or not, but we know that's right there on the verge of that. It's threatening the very promise that God was going to fulfill in the birth of Isaac. And here we have kind of bookending that, another story of Abimelech. And it's a perfect opportunity to show that here was Abraham dealing with the world before Isaac's birth, before the promised son, and here is Abraham dealing with the world and the difficulties of the world after Isaac's birth, after the promised son. And it's this kind of confidence, this trust in the eternal God that has changed how he's living in a world of conflict. So Abimelech is a king. He's a powerful king. He comes this time with his commander, and they recognize that things are different with Abraham. They said, look, things are different now. We know that God is with you. We've talked about this whole time when studying Abraham, that Abraham is living in a land where these powerful kings are popping up. They're taking over their cities. They're expressing their power. We see him interacting with Pharaoh early on in the story. We see him interacting with the kings of the 5 cities that were destroyed. We see him interacting now with Gerar, the king of Gerar, Abimelech. This time Abimelech comes with his military commander. It's just another example that this was the world that Abraham was living in. Abraham was living a life of faith. He was a man who was a shepherd. He trusted in God to send the rains for his flocks. He had to rely on God for his sustenance, for his protection, and all that time he's living as a nomad in the middle of lands that God is raising up bringing up these kings who have powerful armies. They're arming their citizens with weapons, and they're fortifying their cities with walls. And that's the kind of people that Abraham is dealing with. But this time, isn't it interesting that no longer is Abraham sneaking around in Abimelech's territory and afraid to keep him from stealing his wife? That's what happened in Genesis 20, right? In Genesis 20, Abraham leaves the area of Sodom and Gomorrah where he had seen the destruction of those cities. It seems like he's kind of just getting as far away as he can from the destruction that had come down from heaven. He ends up here in the south end of the promised land near Gerar, and there Abimelech sends and takes his wife from him, and Abraham does nothing, right? Abraham keeps quiet because he says, this is the deal I've made with Sarah when we first set out. Anywhere new we go, you just tell them you're my sister because I don't want people to kill you or kill me on your account. That's what Abraham did before. But now after the birth of Isaac, it's Abimelech who's coming to Abraham, right? Abraham suddenly is negotiating from this position of confidence. And Abimelech comes wanting to make an alliance. He says, okay, now God is with you. Things are different with you. And it says that Abraham dwelt many days in the land of the Philistines. This was the land that God had promised to Abraham. When Abraham had stood in the center of this land, God had said, look to the north and east and south and west, look all around you. Everything that you can see, this is going to belong to you and your descendants forever. But here the Bible is calling it the land of the Philistines. It's a land that belonged to Abraham by God's promise. But he lived in that land like it belonged to him. Even though there was tension, there was conflict around him, he continued to live in that land like it was being given to him. So again, let's stop for a minute and just think about some of the implications here. If you've accepted Jesus as your Savior, if you've received Christ, then you've entered into that new life. He's given you this eternal hope. But we live in a world that's temporarily given over to the power of the enemy, right? That's what it says in the book of John. That's what Jesus said. Jesus talked about this world being given into the control of the enemy for this time. But we have the promised son. Do you see the difference that makes for Abraham? Now that he has the promised son, he interacts with the world around him in a totally different way. May I ask you some questions just for you to think about? Do other people recognize that God is with you? That's what they recognize. When Abraham had the promised son, Abimelech suddenly isn't just ogling his wife and trying to take her away. Instead, he looks at Abraham and he says, God is with you. Now remember, Abimelech had a dream about Abraham where God had called Abraham a prophet, but also Abraham was a 100-year-old man who had just had a son. And Abimelech is saying, you know what? There's something going on with you, Abraham. God is with you, clearly. Do people recognize that in you now that you've received Jesus? Now, before you answer that all the way, let me also just follow that up. It could be positive or negative. Some of you might be thinking, I sure wish people recognize that. I sure wish my coworkers saw me come in the room and said, oh, God is with you. Can you help us, give us some direction for what we need to do today? Can you help us make peace here in the office or on the work site today? Sometimes that happens. I would pray that sometimes you'll have a coworker comes and says, hey, I'm going through the most difficult thing I've ever been through, and you seem to have a hope I don't have. Can you help me? That'd be great. It does happen. But let me tell you, this would also be fulfilled if people come to you and said, hey, you're weird. There's something different about you. If they said, hey, don't work over here with us. We don't want to invite you to our party or take you out to lunch when we go out to lunch today. You're different than us. Either way, I'm just asking you, do people recognize that God is with you if you have the promised son? They did for Abraham. Secondly, do you have the confidence to live the life as God is calling you to live, even while we acknowledge that there is conflict around us because of the evil in the world that we live in? In other words, can you recognize, yes, this is a sinful world, yes, there are difficulties here, but have a confidence. God is with me. He's going to keep his promises. For Abraham, his whole mindset has changed now. He's an old man planting young trees. He's a man that says, look, I have an eternal view on things. This guy Abimelech, he used to terrify me. This used to be a concern to me that I have powerful enemies here in the land. But now I've got the promised son. God keeps his promises. I don't know exactly how he's going to work things out in the future, but I have trust in him. In fact, I want to look at the rest of this account and just go through kind of quickly this morning how Abraham's interaction with Abimelech is different now that he has the promised son. Abraham does three things. We see all of these things in the New Testament. There's certainly things that as Christians we ought to be doing as well. But what is it that Abraham does now that he's received the promised son? First of all, I think you'll see that he seeks peace in a world of power. Again, at the beginning of the story, Abimelech comes with his military commander. Both of these names, both Abimelech and Phicol, are difficult for us to tell if they refer to only one individual or if they are actually hereditary titles. We've talked about that when we were introduced to Abimelech in chapter 20, that this may have been a title somewhat like the name Pharaoh, where they called the rulers of Gerar after this man Abimelech. And that could be true of the name Phicol too. It could be that once you were raised to the level of the head of their military, that became your title and not just your name. In either case, Abimelech this time has upped his game a little bit. He's not only this small king of a city, but now he has the leader of an army to come with him. And that makes the treaty-making party with Abraham a lot more tense, doesn't it? Remember, Abraham had a large household when his nephew Lot had been taken years before. He had been able to muster 318 men from his own household to go after him and bring him back. But Abraham doesn't have an army, right? The servants that he has, the people that live in his household, they're shepherds. They're people that keep sheep and flocks. It's a lot different. This is what we would call an asymmetric negotiation, or that's the way Abimelech wants to make it. He's coming as a king with his military commander. Abraham is a shepherd with his servants. Either way, though, Abimelech comes seeking a treaty. It's he that says, hey, before there's any conflict here, we want to make sure that everything's okay between us. And Abraham is willing to make a covenant. This is interesting. Abraham might have had some agreements with the kings that lived in the middle of the nation earlier. We talk about that when Lot was taken. But he also was hesitant to be involved in too many of those alliances, right? He wasn't involved with them with the king of Sodom. In fact, when the king of Sodom wanted to make a deal with him after they had brought Lot and the other captives back, Abraham said, "Oh no." God said, "I'm not going to let you give me anything. We'll have no connection." He was rejecting a treaty at that point. So it's a little bit interesting, if you're following me here, that Abraham suddenly is now saying, "Sure, we'll make a covenant. We'll make an agreement." And I would posit to you that it is now not out of fear of man, but out of trust in God, that Abraham is able to pursue peace, even in a world that has lots of conflict, because he says, you know what? God's in control of all things. God's in control of my enemies. He's in control of the people who might double cross me. They might not keep their end of the bargain. They might not live up to their end of the deal. But you know what? It's not them I'm trusting. It's God that I'm trusting. If Abimelech wants to say he wants peace, I'll agree with him. We'll go for peace. Isn't that exactly what it says to Christians in the New Testament? In Romans, Paul gives us all of what it means to be a Christian, to receive forgiveness through Christ and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And in Romans chapter 12, he starts to tell us how to live, just like Abraham, in a world of conflict now that we've received the promised Son. And what does it say? If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Isn't that interesting? It's exactly what Abraham is doing, that suddenly we have the ability to pursue peace with other people, not because we're afraid of man, but because we're trusting in God. In Hebrews chapter 12, the writer says the same thing, strive for peace with everyone. Having an eternal mindset, having received the promised Son, having taken our eyes off the temporariness of our life and recognizing that we have everlasting promises in God, gives us the confidence to pursue peace with other people. Whether it's that coworker that you have that you feel like we're never going to be in agreement on these things. This person is my ideological enemy. We have to work together, but we never see eye to eye on these things. Suddenly we have the confidence to be the one that says, yeah, if you want peace, we want peace. My God's in control. It might be that family member that you feel has done all kind of damage in your family, the family member that may even threaten still some of the fabric of those relationships. But you're the one saying, yes, if you're willing to have peace, I'm willing to have peace. My God's in control. I'm negotiating from a position of confidence here because my God has eternal promises that he's keeping. If you want peace, I'll receive. I'll have peace. Abraham is willing to pursue peace in this world of conflict. Secondly, now that Abraham has received the promised son, he is asserting the authority of God's promises. Again, this is kind of a short story, and you need to know a little bit of what's happened before with Abimelech and Abraham and understand the area a little bit to know what's going on here. But I want you to follow closely. Abraham was willing to confront Abimelech immediately on the terms of this treaty. So Abraham and Abimelech make this treaty. They said, hey, look, whatever happens, we don't want to have any conflict between us. Abimelech is recognizing that God is with Abraham in a powerful way. Abraham realizes that Abimelech is a powerful man, and they're saying to each other, look, we'll make sure that we don't have any conflict between us if something comes up. But something does come up. Abraham relies on a well that he and his men have dug for their own livestock, and Abimelech's men come and take it away. They run off his shepherds, they run off his flocks so that they don't have water. And Abraham keeps his end of the covenant. He goes to Abimelech and says, hey, I thought we made an agreement. What's going on with your men trying to take away the well that I have dug? And Abimelech says, oh, I didn't know anything about it, Abraham. Now, you and I can make a decision on whether or not you believe Abimelech. I'm going to tell you that if you read later in Genesis the way that Abimelech deals with Isaac, I don't believe him. I don't believe him at all. I think that this is exactly what you would say if you knew exactly what you had done. If you had told your soldiers, hey, look, this Abraham guy, he's taken over too much of the land. Go take that well away. We'll see if he does anything about it. And lo and behold, Abraham does do something about it. He goes to Abimelech and says, hey, your soldiers came and took our well, but that's a well that I dug. But Abimelech is able to say, oh, Abraham, I'm glad you brought this to my attention. I didn't know anything about it until you told me this today. So I'm glad you brought it to my attention. It ends up being successful for Abraham. Abraham is able to receive his well back. In fact, what you're seeing here is Abimelech, the man of power, backing down, right? You would have thought maybe that he had the position where he could negotiate from strength, but he backs down as soon as Abraham brings up his claim. So what's going on here? Again, Abraham is living not out of fear of man, but trusting God now. Now you need to understand a little bit about where Abraham is at. We talked about this when we were introduced to Abimelech in the city of Gerar before. When we talked about Abraham going to Gerar in chapter 20, we said that he was leaving the center of the promised land because of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He had seen God's judgment on those cities, and he's, in a sense, fleeing south. He doesn't make it as far as Egypt this time, which had been his original problem when he first came to the land. So he doesn't go as far as Egypt, but he's about halfway there. His feet are pointed to Egypt in fear. Remember, that's what we said when he went to Gerar to start with. But there is something else to know about this area. Because of this event, they end up naming this area for the future, not Gerar, because Gerar ends up being a temporary city that's gone and lost to history after this. But instead they call it Beersheba, which, by the way, is still a name that we can find in that area of Israel today. And Beersheba, if you look in Judges chapter 20 and 1 Samuel chapter 3, is later kind of recognized as the southern border of the Promised Land. It is the last city, at least on that area, of the border of the land that God gives to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So suddenly, this is what the difference of the birth of Isaac does for Abraham. Before Isaac is born, Abraham is fleeing, and we see him in Gerar, and it's halfway to Egypt. He's running away. After Isaac is born, suddenly Abraham is saying, oh no, I was just marking our territory. This is the southernmost part of the land that God has given to me. This is actually the land that God has given to me. I'm not dwelling here because I'm afraid to live in the middle of the land. I'm dwelling here because I wanted the Philistines to know, hey, this land here, it's actually a land that God promised to me. You guys can have a city here, that's fine. You can make an agreement with me, but the tables have turned now. I have the promised son. This land belongs to me. God has promised me all of this land. If he's allowing you to live here, you can go ahead and do that for now. But it actually belongs to me. This is a powerful change in his life. Once you realize what's going on now, it is fascinating to realize that suddenly Abraham has this new confidence in God's authority. Remember, God had showed him when he first came to the Promised Land, all of this I'm going to give you. And Abraham believed him. But now that Isaac has been born, he believes him in a new, powerful sort of way, right? He's saying, this is the land that this is what God has promised to me. Nothing will take it from me and my descendants. Interestingly, let's do a little bit of a side. You notice what, I only started studying this because in the old King James, when Abimelech comes and wants to make a agreement with Abraham, he says, to my kith and kin, instead of my descendants and posterities. We're having to unwind the English language a little bit. It's kind of poetic in the way it says in the Old English. But Abimelech comes and says to Abraham, I want you to make an agreement with me and my descendants. Now again, we read past that really quick, but let's just stop and think for a minute. Abimelech is saying, hey, Abraham, God's clearly with you. Would you make an agreement with me and my grandchildren? Can you imagine someone saying that to someone who's 100 years old? Abimelech is saying, hey, look, whatever God has said to you, it's going to last. I mean, this is a 100-year-old guy who just had a son. I think he's going to outlast me. I think his claims are going to outlast mine. And now Abraham is living exactly like that is true, right? He's now dwelling in Beersheba, and he's saying, look, this is the southern border of the land that God gave to me. You guys want to make an arrangement with me? You want to make a treaty with me? That's fine. If God allows you to live here, that's okay. But you know who will be here eventually? My descendants. God keeps his promises. Now, let's, again, make a little application. if you've received the promised Son, what is it that God has given you in Christ Jesus? What are we allowed to assert the authority of and say, look, this is what God has given me His forgiveness. God gives me His grace. It cannot be taken from me. The blessing of God is on my life now because I've received the promised Son. It cannot be taken from me. We might find ourselves in a situation of conflict in some place that feels like danger, and at that time we're able to say, well, look, it may feel like danger now, but these promises belong to me now. I worship the everlasting God. Lastly, now that Abraham has received the promised son, he's depending on God to be his defender. So it's Abraham who proposes a symbolic recognition of this treaty with Abimelech. Abraham says, okay, we'll make a covenant, and this is what I'll do now to ratify this covenant since we've had a breach of it. This is another reason, by the way, that I'm convinced Abraham is acknowledging Abimelech has broken the treaty. Abraham is saying, okay, let's make an arrangement to show you've broken the treaty, but you're sorry for it. So here's how we're going to do that. I'm going to give you 7 ewe lambs. Now again, it's interesting to compare the two stories with Abimelech and Abraham. Last time, Abimelech took Sarah from Abraham. God warned him in a dream, you're in big trouble, Abimelech, you better give her back. Abimelech does, and to prove Sarah's innocence, he gives Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver. This time, Abraham gives what he has, not money. Abraham's a shepherd, so he gives lambs out of his flock. And he gives ewe lambs, that are lambs that are not for eating, right? If you know anything about farming, you keep the females, you eat the extra males, right? So Abraham doesn't give him a feast, he gives him animals who are going to reproduce. He gives him a down payment. And in fact, even in those ewe lambs, there's this sense of the blessing of fertility that's come to Abraham's household. There's this sense of generosity in Abraham. Abraham's saying, look, God's providing for me. I got no fear of what he's going to do in the future. In fact, it is almost the opposite of what he told the king of Sodom after their return with the captives, Lot and the others. Remember, the king of Sodom wanted to split some of the proceeds with Abraham, and Abraham said, no, I don't need anything from you. I'm going to make sure it's clear that God has blessed me. Now this is the exact opposite. He said, I can give you whatever I need to, Abimelech. God's blessed me, right? I could even give you 7 ewe. These are the ones that would reproduce for me. These are the ones I would normally keep for myself to make sure I had enough. I can give them to you, though, because I've got an abundance of God's blessing here. And then he tells us what the meaning of these ewe lambs are. He says that they are a witness. And even Abimelech doesn't understand this, by the way. Abimelech may have been expecting gold. He may have been expecting some sort of other, maybe a punishment. Maybe he's expecting Abraham to call him on his lie and say, no, you did know exactly what you're doing. This is the punishment I expect from you. Because Abimelech has to ask, what is this that you're doing, Abraham? Okay, I have some experience here in trees and things, but I don't know what you're doing. I don't understand what you're doing. And Abraham says, well, these lambs are going to be a witness. And who are they a witness to? They're a witness before God, right? It's as if Abraham is saying, actually, Abimelech, you don't have anything to do with this. This is between me and God. This is a witness between me and God. God, have you seen what Abimelech did? And now you see that he's sorry for it. I'm going to give him these lambs, and this is going to be like a signed affidavit before God himself. Okay, God, you told me you're going to protect me from Abimelech, right? And you'll keep that promise. Does that make sense? It's like Abimelech is not even a plaintiff in this suit anymore. Abraham's putting him in the back of the line, saying, actually, I was having a conversation with God about this, Abimelech. I'm going to give you these lambs, and it's a witness between me and God. God, have you seen what Abimelech tried to do to me, and you're delivering me from it today? This will be a witness that you'll do it again in the future. You'll take care of me in any of these conflicts in the future. That the same everlasting God who showed his power by giving him the promised son could protect him against his powerful enemies. So again, think about what that means as a Christian. if you're one who has received the promised Son, then we're depending on God to be our defender. No matter what happens this week, no matter what happens this month, if it's a threat to your finances, if it's a threat to your health, if there's danger for your family, we're saying to God, God, you've already showed me that you keep your promises, that you're the everlasting God. How is it that you're going to deliver us from these things? We know that you are. We're recognizing already that you're the one that's going to deliver us. You can be our defender in this world of conflict. It's interesting to see the difference that receiving the promised Son does for Abraham. I want to challenge you this morning, maybe similar to what that preacher challenged me at youth camp when I was just a teenager. If Jesus hasn't changed you, then he hasn't saved you. What is the difference that receiving the promised Son has made in your life? I'm not setting up some moral gold standard. I'm just asking you, what has your thinking changed? For Abraham, it changed. He was the same man, but he was one who went from as good as dead to the father of nations now. He now was able to say, no, it's not all coming to an end for me. It's going to be an everlasting thing for me. Have you received Jesus and now have that everlasting hope, that eternal hope? If you haven't, I pray that you would do that today, that you would begin that relationship with Jesus even today, that that's available for you even now. If you're going to claim the name of Christian, if you've received Jesus, and many in this room have, then can you do what Abraham is doing? Can you seek peace in a world of power? Can you say, okay, God, you're in control. I've seen, I have witnessed, I have experienced Jesus in my life. I can seek peace with others, even if they think it's a power play. I can assert the authority of God's promises. God, what you have given to me, I can stand up for. This is the blessed life that God has planned for me. I can depend on God to be my defender. I can say, no, my struggles are not against flesh and blood. My treaties are not with the people of this world. I'm just asking God to be a witness. God, you see what's going on here. Will you defend my cause? Will you be the one? How are you going to show yourself powerful in this situation? I would encourage you, if you're already a believer, to live in light of having received the promised Son.